Welcome back to another episode of Wrong Sports, and let me take you back to a time in the United States where we were just getting used to a peaceful time when we weren't fighting a world war or in the Great Depression. This was a time in America where even more men and women were working, going to college, and growing the country. It was 1950, which was the kickoff to a decade of change, not only in America, but in college football. And it brought us a year in college football where numerous big events and big games happened. But before I get into how the year was won in college football in 1950, make sure you go below and subscribe to the channel. Please also ring the bell so you can get updates on when I'm going to be dropping brand new videos. Plus, check out the podcast, my social media, and my Patreon where you can help out the channel. All those links in the description below. But going into the 1950 season of college football, there were plenty of great players and good teams. This was because after World War II, many of the men that survived the war would come back and look to get their education using new federal funds. Along with the rise in athletes, it would also bring more eyes to the product and another poll. Talked about the first year of the AP poll in my 1936 episode of How the Year Was Won, and you can see a link above for that. But this year there would be another new poll in the Coaches Poll. The Coaches Poll would run through the United Press International and would poll 35 of the best college football coaches from all over the country. The poll would rank the top 20 teams, and it would be like the AP poll in that it would name a national champion after the regular season instead of after the bowl games. And this would again be significant towards the end of the season, so remember that. But when the 1950 football season kicked off, there were a few programs coming off of a great 1940 decade. One of those was Notre Dame. Notre Dame was coming in on a 4+ year-long unbeaten streak, as their last loss was in December 1945, and they went undefeated in 1949 with Heisman winner Leo Hart, and they also won the national title that year. Leon Hart would graduate after that season, so he wouldn't be playing in 1950, but it didn't matter to pollsters as they ranked Notre Dame number 1, mostly because of their consistency and because they still had their Hall of Fame coach, Frank Leahy. Leahy was a big lover of Notre Dame, who won a pair of national titles before World War II, and then took a break from Notre Dame during the war. But when he came back to coach Notre Dame in 1946, the team responded by not losing for him. They would start the 1950 season with many expectations for another great season, even without the Heisman winner, because they showed how quickly they could reload over the last 4 years. And they would show just how good they were in their first game on September 30th, as they beat number 20 ranked UNC 14-7. To go along with Notre Dame, there was another team with an amazing 1940 decade, and that was Army. Army football in the 1940s were some of the greatest teams of all time, as they had several Heisman winners and they rarely lost. If you want to see just how dominant they were and how they rarely, if ever, lost, check out my deep dive of the Army winning streak during World War II. You can check that out in the link in the upper right-hand corner. But they were coming in with an amazing 49-2-4 record from 1944 to 1949 and were undefeated in 1949, but finished second behind Notre Dame. This happened in 1946 and 1947, and these teams stopped playing each other after their famous 1946 tie due to Notre Dame not wanting to play Army anymore. And there are a few reasons for that I won't get into, but due to them not, we had to leave it up to pollsters to give us national champions of the last few years. And Army would be coming into the season with another great rushing attack, led by the coach's son, Bob Blake, at QB, and about a dozen rushers that carried the ball every game. They showed they could still run in their first game versus Colgate, as Blake would misfire on his first 12 passes, but he couldn't ruin the rushing attack, as they had over 400 yards, and to go along with that, they still had an amazing, stout defense that didn't let anything through, so they won 28-0. With the top 2 teams winning easily in their only September games, the rest of the top 5 had some shakeups in the first week of the season. The number 3 team in the preseason AP poll was Michigan. They were coached by Bernie Oosterbaan, who was in his 3rd season with a national title in his first year and a Big Ten Coach Championship title in 1949. This year they would have a strong line led by All-American Robert "Brick" Wall. that made their defense very good and helped protect their offense. Meanwhile, the offense was led by Chuck Ortman, who would pass, run, and kick for Michigan and was their best all-around player. And they would need all of Ortman in their first game, which was a banger versus their in-state rival Michigan State. Michigan State was led by Duffy Daughtry, who was in his 4th season, and he was building a monster of a team. In his first 3 seasons in East Lansing, they had winning records and were ranked in the top 20 in their last 2 seasons. This year they would be ranked number 19, and they had a huge line that would have to block for their best runner, Sonny Grandulus. And those lines would stand up to Michigan and also knock out U of M's best player in Ortman in the first quarter. And Michigan without Ortman couldn't get enough offense, and Michigan State would end up giving the ball to Grandulus as he would run for 184 yards and 1 touchdown to hold off Michigan for the big 14-7 win. So this loss would cause some shakeups in the poll, as Notre Dame was number 1, and Michigan State would now move all the way up to number 2 to start the month of October. Right behind those 2 teams were a team that might not be at the top of the polls now, but in the 1930s and the 1940s, the SMU Mustangs were one of the best teams, as they won tons of games behind Oak Walker. Plus, this whole time they were coached by Matty Bell, who after 15 years would just retire before the 1950 season. SMU wouldn't look far though for a new coach, as they promoted assistant coach Rusty Russell as head coach. SMU under their new coach still looked great as they played their first game September 23rd versus Georgia Tech and won by 20. Then they followed that up with a road game versus Ohio State. Now, Ohio State were coming off of a Big Ten title the previous year and were ranked in the top 10 to start the season. The game would be a back-and-forth affair with scoring coming easy to both, but SMU would survive and win 32-27. These 2 wins shot SMU up the polls, and now going into October, SMU were ranked number 3. So I mentioned Michigan State a little while ago as the new number 2 team, and just as quickly as they became that, they would quickly fall out of that spot, as on October 7th they played Maryland at home. Maryland was quickly becoming one of the best Southern teams, behind their coach Jim Tatum. Tatum became the coach just after World War II, after a 1-season stint at Oklahoma, and he quickly made Maryland a good team, with winning records, including a 9-1 record in 1949 and a Gator Bowl win. And Maryland were coming into the game 1-1. Maryland would have motivation for this game too, as their only loss the previous season was versus Michigan State. And Maryland would use that motivation to hold Michigan State's offense to 140 rushing yards. On top of that, Michigan State completed 3 of 20 passing attempts, with Maryland being the top receiver, as they intercepted 6 passes to win 34-7. And that dominant loss by a top 5 team would be echoed later on in the day, as Notre Dame was in action versus in-state rival Purdue. Purdue were coming off of some mediocre years after World War II under their coach Stu Holcomb. It didn't start all that bad for Purdue in their first game versus Texas. They didn't come out with a win, but it was a shootout as they lost 32-29. So Purdue weren't coming into this game looking too bad, and they didn't show it in this game versus Notre Dame either, as they would be able to score 4 times and keep Notre Dame out of the end zone for most of this game and win 28-14. And if you thought that this big win for Purdue would help them throughout the rest of the season, it didn't, as they would continue to lose and lost all the way until Thanksgiving to finish their year 2-7. So quite a weird loss for Notre Dame, and due to that one, it would knock Notre Dame out of the top 5. And I'm just going to mention the rest of the season here because it doesn't go too well for them after that loss, and would also end their season with a loss to their rival USC to be 4-4-1. So because of all those losses, for the second week in a row, there would be new teams in the top 5 and new ones at the top, as Army would be number 1, SMU would be number 2, and Oklahoma would be number 3, with Texas at 4. But don't get used to that, because coming up just a few days later on October 14th, Texas and Oklahoma would play each other in the Cotton Bowl. This was a huge game for the month of October and would set the stage for the rest of the season. And this Red River rivalry game was like most of these rivalry games, close and fought until the last second. The game was all Texas as they got to the goal line twice in the first 3 quarters, but were stopped at the 1 and then fumbled on one of them too. Oklahoma, meanwhile, had tons of trouble getting to the goal line, but did finally score to take a 7-6 lead late in the game. But just as Oklahoma was driving to add to their lead, they were pick-sixed, and Texas would take a 13-7 lead. But Oklahoma would have one more chance due to a low snap on a Texas punt, and Oklahoma would now at the Texas 11. And moments later, Billy Vessels dashed right around the right end for a touchdown, and they converted the much-needed extra point to win 14-13. So with that big Oklahoma win, the October 16th poll saw Army at number 1, Oklahoma at number 2, and SMU at number 3. And these 3 teams would rule the top of the poll for the rest of the month. But they would move around a bit due to wins by them, example being in the October 23rd poll, SMU would take over the top spot due to their big win over a top 15 ranked Rice team, making them 5-0, and Army would go down to number 2 with Oklahoma at number 3. That poll stayed like this until the start of November and a big-time matchup for number 1 SMU as they traveled to Austin to play the Longhorns of Texas, who were still ranked, they were number 7, and still only had 1 loss. And the game was all Texas early as they scored first and held a 14-7 lead at half. And after half, Texas continued to dominate as they made it 21-7 early in the 3rd quarter. SMU would be able to score one more time, but they couldn't get the ball again and would lose 23-20, sending another number 1 team out of the top 5, and now the new number 1 for the first poll of November would be Army. And I mentioned a little bit about Army at the beginning of the video, and they just continued to win after their first game as they would beat Penn State and Michigan by a combined score of 68-13, and then they traveled to Boston and New York City to shut out Harvard and Columbia before going to Philly to play Penn. Army went into the Penn game knowing that a big win over them might propel them to number 1, and with the loss of SMU, it did just that. Another fun fact is Army's last loss was November 8th, 1947 to Notre Dame, and after 3 years and not suffering a loss, Army would reclaim the top spot. And right behind Army would be a new number 2 team in Ohio State, who you might remember lost their first game versus SMU, but after that they went on a tear, winning 5 straight with 2 shutouts of Big Ten teams Minnesota and Northwestern. And that might be because they had one of the best all-around players at the time, Vic Janowicz. Janowicz in 1950 played both offense and defense, averaged 50 minutes per game, and to go along with that, his coach, Wes Fessler, who was one of the last coaches to use the single wing formation, put Janowicz at tailback, where he ran, passed, punted, blocked, and place kicked. Janowicz threw for 4 touchdown passes in a 41-7 victory over Pittsburgh, and then he made a 90-yard punt in a 48-0 victory over Minnesota. But one of his best games might be when the Buckeyes beat down Iowa 83-21. Janowicz was responsible for 46 points in the game as he ran for 2 touchdowns. One was a 61-yard punt return. He passed for 4 touchdowns and then kicked 10 extra points. Ohio State would have another tough Big Ten game coming up November 11th versus Wisconsin, and Wisconsin was coming into the game 5-1 just like Ohio State, but Wisconsin had their loss more recent as it was 3 weeks ago, and it was versus Michigan. So not only was this game for a top polling position, but it was to put themselves in the driver's seat for the Rose Bowl. And Ohio State was at home and had control of this game the whole way through, as they scored 3 touchdowns, with the last one rushed in by Janowicz, and they would eventually hold on to win 19-14. The win would push Ohio State up the polls to number 1, leapfrogging Army in the November 2nd poll. With Ohio State now number 1, it bumped Army down to number 3, even though Army had another shutout and again was still undefeated for the last 3 years. The other team that leapfrogged Army this week was Oklahoma, who dominated Missouri and remained undefeated. There would be only 2 more AP polls left, as the last one came out the Monday or Tuesday after Thanksgiving. That would come important to the end of this year. But anyway, Ohio State was riding high, and with 2 games left, were close to the Big Ten title and the Rose Bowl, but had to travel to Illinois to play the Illini. Illinois was like Ohio State in that they had 1 loss early in the season, and then they went on a 5-game winning streak, shutting out Michigan and Indiana to be ranked in the top 10. The game was a bruising affair, with Illinois able to stop Ohio State and Janowitz pretty much all game, only letting them in the end zone 1 time, and Illinois was able to take the lead and hold on to win 14-7. So the roller coaster season for Ohio State would hit another downhill with the loss, and it would send Ohio State to number 8 in the November 20th poll. The new number 1 would be Oklahoma, with the new number 2 being Army, who would both win this week, as Army shut out Stanford and Oklahoma beat down Missouri to keep these rankings, as the new number 3 would be Kentucky out of the SEC, with number 4 being California. So we really haven't heard much about Kentucky this season. How did they get all the way up to number 3, you might ask? Well, for one thing, they were 10-0, as they played 5 out-of-conference games, most famous of which was traveling to Philadelphia to play Villanova, and Southern teams didn't travel to the Northeast that much at this point. And they played 5 SEC games, with 2 shutouts. 1 was over LSU. Along with that, Kentucky was also coached this season by Bear Bryant. He was still in his early part of his coaching career, but him turning around Kentucky in 5 years definitely got people talking. Kentucky would have 1 game left for Tennessee. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and it would be for the SEC title. Tennessee was coming in 8-1. They had their legendary coach Robert Neyland. And with Vanderbilt next week, Tennessee would still have another game after this, while this was Kentucky's final game. Tennessee's only loss this season was to Mississippi State in the 2nd week of the season. And by the way, Mississippi State lost to Kentucky by 2 touchdowns 2 weeks before they beat Tennessee. But the Kentucky-Tennessee game would be played in sub-freezing temperatures in Knoxville, and it would work out for Tennessee as they were able to cause multiple fumbles on Kentucky, who couldn't get any points. But lucky for Tennessee, they would get their only score on a touchdown pass just a few minutes before half and held on to win 7-0. The loss would ruin Kentucky's hopes for a perfect season, and it continued their 15-year-long losing streak to Tennessee. And another fun note on this game was, there were rumors just below the game story of this game that I found about how Bear Bryant was going to leave Kentucky, so it shows just how much attention he drew to himself with this Kentucky turnaround. And Bryant would leave Kentucky in 1953 though, for Texas A&M. So they were about 3 years too early on their prediction. So with the Kentucky loss, it would obviously knock them out of the top 5, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the team right behind Kentucky at number 4 in the rankings were the Cal Bears. And the Cal Bears were the rulers of the Pacific Coast Conference at this point. They had went undefeated in their regular season in 1948 and 1949, but lost the Rose Bowl game, so they were never able to complete a full season of being unbeaten. They were coming into this Thanksgiving game, by the way, 9-0 again, and would play their biggest rival, Stanford. Stanford were coming in 5-3-1. After starting 4-0, but then lost 2 straight PCC games and can only win 1 more time to come limping into this game. California, meanwhile, were ready to win and to move on to the Rose Bowl, which they were all assured to go to after beating Washington, the 2nd place team, earlier in the season. And the game was all California early as they led 7-0, but couldn't add on to it, and Stanford was able to come back to get a touchdown and tie it at 7. Neither team was able to get in the end zone again or score any other points, so the game would end in a tie. The game was looked at as a loss though to Cal, as it sent them down the poll to number 5, but they were still able to go to the Rose Bowl that year. So this was the final AP poll, and it would come out November 27th, 1950, and it would name Oklahoma number 1 after they went 9-0 in the season and just beat their biggest competition in the Big 7 that year, in Nebraska by 2 touchdowns. Oklahoma would be playing in Bedlam versus Oklahoma A&M, who are now Oklahoma State, and that game would be happening December 2nd. And Oklahoma were going to be going to the Orange Bowl on New Year's Day. So this was the cherry on top to their perfect season. Right behind Oklahoma and missing out on their chance to win a national title, even though they were undefeated again, was Army. And I'll get to Army in a moment because the rest of their season is important. At number 3 was Texas, and Texas still had 2 games left, and we're going to be going to the Cotton Bowl as they were the Southwest Conference champions, and more on them too. Number 4 was Tennessee, and number 5 was Cal, who I mentioned already. And Cal, by the way, would be going to the Rose Bowl to play Michigan, who beat Ohio State at home in what is now called the Snow Bowl, which was basically a snowy mess of a game that involved really no offense, just a lot of kicking, and Michigan was able to win on blocking 2 punts for a touchdown and a safety. And if you want to make an Ohio State fan mad, you can just mention this game to them. But Ohio State may have ended with 2 straight losses, but they would have the Heisman winner, as Vic Janowitz was named it soon after this loss. Ohio State would end up firing Wes Fesler at the end of the year due to him having losing records versus Michigan, but they would end up replacing him with the legendary Woody Hayes, so I felt like I had to mention that. But anyway, back to the season, because I mentioned there were still games left, even though the AP put out their final poll, which is absolutely annoying. Let's start with the most shocking upset in college football history to date, pretty much. And I'm also starting with this game because it happened first in the timeline. But it was happening in Philly at the enormous Philadelphia Municipal Stadium. It was the annual Army-Navy game. I've mentioned Army a lot already because they've been a main character of the season already, so really no need to mention them too much more. But I do need to mention their opponent, Navy. Now, Navy football after World War II really fell apart. Plus, they really started to lose their grip on beating Army around 1942. And then after World War II, and with Army having their amazing Heisman backfield and all their media attention, they really fell into the cellar. From 1946 to 1949, Navy went 5, 28, and 3, and they never beat Army, but they did come close in 1948. In 1949, Navy would get a new coach as they hired Eddie Erdlatz, and he was an assistant at Navy from 1945 to 1947, and Navy under him in the 1950 season would start pretty badly, as they went 0-3. But then they beat USC at home, and that was a big first win for them, and it looked like it would start some more winning, but then they went on another 3-game losing streak and only scored 17 points total. A week before Thanksgiving, Navy would travel to New York to play Columbia and beat them for their second win to lead them into this Army game. With just about 103,000 people in attendance, this game would have even more emotions because Army just lost their captain from the previous year in Johnny Trent, as he was killed in action in Korea 2 weeks before this game. The loss of Trent and the loss of their captain during their record-setting 1944-1945 season, Tom Lombardo, in September, was also a damper on this undefeated season. But the game would start slow as Navy knew their opponent well, and Navy always played really well and was of course always looking to beat Army no matter how good or bad their season was going. Last year's game was a huge shutout win by Army, but in 1948 these two teams tied, and that was Navy's only high point of a winless season. No matter how bad Navy was, this game was always going to be hard fought by them. The game would start scoreless in the first quarter, but then Navy would find a hero in their junior quarterback, Bob Sastro. In what amounted literally to his 15 minutes of fame, he sprinted through the middle of Army's defense for a 7-yard touchdown, then tossed a 30-yard scoring pass, and did all of this before halftime. At half, Army was only able to have 3 yards of total offense, and Navy's defense would do the same in the second half, as they would intercept quarterback Bob Blake 5 times and added 3 more turnovers to get the shocking 14-2 win over Army. And this loss was Army's first loss in over 3 years. And if you've seen highlights of this game or the box score, it was really no shock that Navy won, as they led in first downs 13-5 and total yardage by almost double. Plus they had 5 interceptions, which was the same amount of passes that Navy completed and one less than Army completed in this game. But while that shocking loss was happening, people in Oklahoma were also happening for no screw-ups in their game versus Oklahoma A&M. And don't worry, even though this game is called Bedlam, no Bedlam happened, as Oklahoma ended up winning 41-14 and completed their perfect 10-0 season. Tennessee was also playing at this time, but had no issues as they beat Vandy, shutting them out and ending their season 10-1. But before we get to some bowl game fun, there was another poll that came out. This poll was the United Press Coaches poll that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, I don't have weekly results of it, so I didn't use it for much of this video. However, I will be using it now because it was quite interesting, as they had a poll come out December 5th. This means it reflected the few big early December games that happened. For one, Army wasn't number 2 like they were in the AP poll, as they ended up number 5 after they lost to Navy. Also in the final coaches poll was number 4 Cal, number 3 Tennessee, number 2 was Texas, and number 1 was of course Oklahoma. I say of course because Oklahoma was undefeated and dominated most of their schedule. Plus, they beat the number 2 team, so there was really no one to jump them. Plus, with the Army loss, 32 out of the 35 voters voted Oklahoma number 1. And it was clear that if Army didn't lose, there may have been a different result. But even after that poll came out, there was still more crazy things that would be happening in the bowl games. Since this was before TV ruled all of the bowl games would happen pretty much at the same time, and they would happen all in the afternoon. That does sound crazy since we are all used to bowl games being scheduled for the max number of games per day and the max number of viewers. Now, since most people didn't have TVs yet, or if you tuned in on radio or the slim number of TVs you watched, you could really only watch one bowl game and you had to stick with it. The classic one and the one that always gets a lot of attention was the Rose Bowl. Since Michigan had 3 losses and just barely beat Ohio State, they were the slight underdog to the unbeaten Cal Bears. The line makers were right to be cautious of the favorite Cal Bears, as this game started slow with a scoreless first quarter. Then before half, Cal would score to take a 6-0 lead. Though the second half looked like it would be much of the same, but then Michigan's offense turned it on, as their quarterback Chuck Ortman was back completing passes. He went 15 of 19 during this game, and their running back would also finally get in the end zone for them in the fourth quarter, giving them the lead. They would get another touchdown late in the game to cement their 14-6 win and give Cal their 3rd consecutive Rose Bowl loss. Going on in the Cotton Bowl was the only bowl game between top 5 teams, as Tennessee, ranked number 4, would play the number 3 in the AP and number 2 in the coaches poll, Texas. The game was pretty much 2 games, as the first half Texas led 14-7, as they scored twice just before halftime. But after half, it looked like they might hold on to win. But then Tennessee would finally get closer, after a 16-play drive, to score a touchdown with 10 minutes left, but then they missed the extra point, so they were still down by 1. Texas would get the ball and have to hold on to it for the next 10 minutes, but after 7, they would fumble and give Tennessee the ball in Texas territory. It would take Tennessee 5 plays to score again and take the 20-14 lead, and they would hold on to it to win, giving them an 11-1 record, while Texas was 9-2. And I also want to mention that after the season, Texas coach Blair Cherry would retire, citing health reasons, but later on he would say that fan and media pressure was the main reason for his health declining, as he would get many ulcers and loss of sleep due to stress. This was just one of the early examples of how much pressure there was on college football coaches, players, and the schools to win games. The final big bowl game of the night was with number 1 Oklahoma versus number 7 Kentucky. Oklahoma was favored by a touchdown, but Kentucky had something up their sleeve as they changed up their defense. The defensive change really confused Oklahoma, and they fumbled in the first quarter, which led to a Kentucky touchdown. Kentucky would get another touchdown in the second half after a long drive and had a 13-0 lead at half. After half, though, Kentucky couldn't add to their lead, but Oklahoma couldn't do really anything either. And one big example was when Oklahoma had the ball at the Kentucky 3-yard line, but couldn't get in the end zone on 4 plays. Oklahoma did finally manage, though, to score with under 10 minutes left, but it was too late for them to make the comeback. And for the second time in the day, an unbeaten team was defeated. This was a bigger upset because Oklahoma was undefeated and the winner of both national titles from big pollsters. So like I mentioned earlier, it was really important that I mentioned final polls came out after the regular season, not after bowl games. Because if they came out after bowl games, Tennessee might have been the national champion this year. But this practice of doing polls before bowl games bit polls in the ass because top teams lost in bowl games pretty routinely. And I did a video on the 1965 season with the first bowl game poll, and you can see the link above. But I really wanted to cover this season because we started to see the new age of college football. The new age of new players that came out after World War II. There would be more money too going into college football, and we would see a lot of big changes happening all across the divisions of college football as well in the 1950s and going into the 1960s. But you can hear more about that in future videos that I have done on How the Year Was Won, and I'm also going to do future videos on that as well in How the Year Was Won. But thank you so much for checking out How the Year Was Won 1950. If you like this video, please give me a like below. Also share this video with other college football fans, and of course subscribe to the channel below. Ring the bell as well so you can get updates on brand new videos, and check out my Patreon, my podcast, and my social media links in the description below. Plus, have a great day.